Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our second webinar on hazard mapping, permafrost, and community planning in the Northwest Territories. We had one webinar already on landscape changes in the Peel Plateau, and we really do encourage you, if you haven't watched that webinar already, to take a look at it. It's available on YouTube. The address is there on your screen. Steve Cookell shared his research on fossil lumping and showed time-lapse photography as well from some of his work. This webinar series it has been presented by Ecology North, the Northwest Territories Association of Communities, and the Pembina Institute, with funding from the Rural Secretariat. I'm Ellen Pond. I'm a Senior Technical and Policy Advisor with the Pembina Institute, and we're very pleased this morning that Brian Sieben has been able to join us from the Climate Change Adaptation Group with the Government of Northwest Territories to share some of the initiatives that they're working on as well. We also have a couple of other people on the team this morning, T. Lim and Yellowknife and Kevin Sauvé. T will be moderating questions and comments, so if you have any questions or comments, please do direct them towards T. You can send them with the chat or question box on your screen. And again, any audio or visual questions, please send direct to Kevin Sauvé. By way of introduction, I'm Ellen Pond. I work with the Pembina Institute doing both adaptation and climate change mitigation, a lot of community energy planning, as well as adaptation work with communities. I'm a registered landscape architect with the BC Society of Landscape Architects, and also a journey person carpenter. So I started off actually building buildings and have now moved into community planning and deciding where those buildings will get built. And just wanted to hand it over to Brian to introduce himself. I think of him as the adaptation guy, but I'll let Brian do that introduction himself.
Good morning. Thanks, Alan. My name is Brian Sieben, and I work in the Climate Change Unit of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources of the Government of the Northwest Territories. As it says on the slide, I had the pleasure of getting introduced to the Northwest Territories climate change issues through my master's at UBC. And I really enjoy my job working to facilitate adaptation within the Northwest Territories government, working across government on many different issues.
Thanks, Brian. And just before we get started, we wanted to put in a plug for the permafrost workshop that's happening in Yellowknife November 5th to 7th. Registration is open and everyone is welcome. And very important to note, it includes webcast participations. If you aren't able to make it in person, you can participate through the webcast. And please check out the program online. There's a great lineup of speakers and covers a wide range of topics in permafrost in the north. So everyone is invited and welcome to that conference as well. So today with our webinar goals, we have a couple of goals. We wanted to share northern resources about permafrost and adaptation, and share some of the initiatives that are going on with ENR, as well as some of the new resources that have come out recently. And we wanted to explore how we can integrate hazard mapping and permafrost and climate change into community land use planning. So briefly, we're going to go over hazard mapping and why we want to use it in community planning. We're going to use permafrost as an example and think about how we understand permafrost and what do we need to know. So really focusing less on the detailed science of permafrost and more on what are some of the issues and features of permafrost that are really significant to understand from a community's perspective and community planning perspective, and then think about the implications for communities. And then Brian is going to share a number of ENR initiatives with us as well. So to start off with hazard mapping, what are landscape hazards? They are landscape features that could present risks to buildings and infrastructure. And I think here it's really important to understand that the hazard is a presence of a landscape feature that could present a risk. And actually, when we look at a risk, it's both the presence of that hazard and then the consequences if something were to happen. So the consequences to people, to buildings, to communities. So hazard is the presence and risk is the sensitivity or the probability of that hazard happening, occurring, and the consequences. So for example, fossil lumping due to permafrost melting is a hazard. it becomes a risk when buildings, people, or infrastructure could suffer negative consequences. And this is really important to understand from a community planning perspective, because it's at the community planning level that we can try to mitigate the consequences from landscape hazards. And I wanted to share an example of that just off the start, so we can actually just look at images of what we are talking about when we talk about hazard mapping. This is an example drawn from work by Melanie Irvine of Memorial University, working with the community of Paulatuk. And they looked at a number of different hazards and mapped them out. So the first one was coastal erosion, looking at where there was significant and moderate erosion along the coastline. Then looking at snow drifting in the community, snow drifting which can impact the stability of the underlying permafrost. Looking at water ponding in the community and mapping that out. And again, water ponding and drainage issues can really transfer heat into the underlying permafrost. And then mapping the permafrost, and in Paulatuk, the permafrost does underlie the whole community. Not a lot of spatial differentiation is known about it at this point, and the depth is not known. And importantly to note, the permafrost right now is cold permafrost around -7 degrees Celsius. However, it is projected to warm to about 3 degrees Celsius by 2050. And so then to produce a hazard map, you take a composite map, you put all of those layers together and come up with what they're calling here levels of risk: high, moderate, and low levels of risk. And I think the next step is to say, once we have those hazard maps, what are the implications for communities, and how can we bring that into community planning to help support decision making at the local level? There's a number of reasons why hazard maps are really helpful in community planning, and it can help make informed decisions. They can help with deciding where and how to build new development. Good siting on suitable land, and what kinds of conditions you might need to consider when you're building. What kinds of existing buildings and infrastructure could be at risk both now and in the future. They can also help think about what kinds of emergencies the communities might need to plan for. So quite a number of uses for hazard maps. And one of the ways I think that they could be used has been already addressed in the Northwest Territories Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation Report from 2008. And this was looking specifically at flooding and thinking about planning for the future, and noting that the flood zones in communities might need to be redefined. So they might need to be changed because of changes in water levels, increased heavy precipitation events, and melting permafrost. And those new flood zone definitions might mean that existing infrastructure or buildings may need to be relocated, and there might need to be limits placed on which lands are available for future development. So, and I think that this will be an adaptive management thing. Over time, those flood zones may need to be reevaluated several times in an ongoing way, and thinking about potentially having to relocate infrastructure, and then also thinking about which areas are more suitable or less suitable for future development. So hazard maps really can help with resilient community planning. If we understand the landscape systems and the landscape hazards, then we can build in the most suitable locations. We can have suitable conditions for those buildings and infrastructure, and all of this helps to minimize service costs, to reduce risk, ensure resilient communities over the long term. So we're going to look at permafrost as an example and think about landscape hazards, their significance for land use planning and site design. And permafrost is a pretty good example because it affects bearing capacity, can impact differential settlement, frost heave, and land stability. And it has been used as part of the foundation system really for a lot of buildings and infrastructure in communities in the Northwest Territories. Permafrost in the Northwest Territories underlies most of the land base, and in the last webinar, Steve described permafrost as the glue that holds the landscape together. And the first 15 minutes of that webinar actually described permafrost, so I'm just going to hit on a few highlights now that I think are very significant to communities, rather than going in great detail into describing permafrost. The first one, though, I think the first significant feature to note is that there is continuous and discontinuous permafrost. Roughly, the division between those follows the tree line, and if you're in a continuous permafrost zone, then you will need to be assessing the conditions to determine hazards and risk and suitability. If you're in a discontinuous, you do want to be thinking about what's the spatial variability and distribution. Do I have permafrost underlying my community or parts of my community, and what does that mean? And very quickly, permafrost as a landscape system is really about heat flows. So in the summer, the warmer air, heat flows from the warmer air through the active layer, which melts and thaws seasonally, and down into the permafrost. And there is a buffer layer here, say of organic material and sometimes shrub layer, that can actually help to buffer that heat loss heat flow and slow it down in the summer down into the permafrost. In the winter, the heat flow is reversed, and actually the heat flow is from the permafrost and the frozen ground through the now frozen active layer and up to the colder winter air above. And again, in the winter, the snow layer acts as a buffer and an insulating blanket. And the deeper the snow layer, the less that heat is able to flow out of the permafrost. So in the summer, the permafrost will start to warm a bit at the upper layers, and as the surface air temperatures warm with climate change, you get more and more heat flow into the permafrost, and in the winter the permafrost cools down as the heat flow goes from the permafrost to the air. And another important feature of permafrost is that we can distinguish between warm and cold permafrost. Warm permafrost is between about -4 and -3 degrees Celsius and 0, and then cold permafrost is below -4 degrees Celsius. And I think this is significant for a number of reasons. Warm permafrost is closer to thawing, so there is both current and near future sensitivity. And climate change could shift warm permafrost to a thaw state. And the CSA Technical Guide on Permafrost that has just come out recently notes that frozen soils weaken as they warm. They weaken as they warm. And of course, when ice thaws entirely, so if you have ice-rich permafrost, you lose bearing capacity. And I think of this a bit like a popsicle that when it's frozen holds up the stick, and then when it thaws, obviously will no longer hold up the stick. So in ice-rich soils, you can lose a lot of bearing capacity. You can have increased differential settlement and increased frost heave. There's one other feature of warm permafrost I think is really significant to communities who are looking to understand what's happening with permafrost under climate change, and that is that monitoring the changes in permafrost can be really difficult in warm permafrost that is close to 0. Because when it's close to 0, the heat that's going into the permafrost from the surface air is actually working on the state change from ice to water. So it's thawing the permafrost rather than raising the temperature of the permafrost. And what does this mean for communities that are monitoring their permafrost? If you're monitoring your permafrost, for example, Norman Wells, we can see here, and this is permafrost data that was taken from a depth of 10 meters from 1984 to 2007. You can see that in the permafrost at Norman Wells and the permafrost at Wrigley, that the temperature has been going up. But the permafrost at Fort Simpson and northern Alberta, the temperature has stayed about the same. This does not actually mean that there's no changes in the permafrost. It means that the heat that's going into the permafrost is melting the permafrost rather than raising the temperature. So you have to be very careful monitoring the permafrost when you get to near 0, because you could be going through a state change, but you can't see that necessarily in the temperature that you're monitoring. Cold permafrost, why is that significant? The sensitivity to climate change is longer term. It does mean, though, that buildings and infrastructure with long lifespans could still be impacted. So if you think about that hazard map that I showed from Paulatuk that showed the permafrost underlying the whole community and said permafrost out to 2050 could go from being a -7 degrees permafrost to -3 degrees permafrost. There you've shifted now from cold to warmer permafrost. Could have some implications for bearing capacity, for example, and if you've got buildings and infrastructure with long lifespans out to 2050, they could be impacted. In the shorter term, the active layer could increase in depth, and then you could have more issues with frost heave. EBA has done work with the Northwest Territories Association of Communities and has actually mapped out the sensitivity to climate change for permafrost conditions across the Northwest Territories. So many thanks to EBA for their work and Northwest Territories Association of Communities for supplying this map. And you can see that there's high sensitivity are the red dots. And those are found in this case, especially in the Beaufort area, and that's because the permafrost is warm. So there's not much more warming with climate change that can happen before you start to have impacts in those communities. The Northeast, the permafrost is colder, and so there's some room now and some time before climate change starts to affect building foundations. As you move south, there's lower sensitivity for a couple of reasons. One is that you're moving into the discontinuous permafrost zone and there's less permafrost in a lot of those communities. And secondly, often that permafrost was already warm when buildings and infrastructure were built and so may not have been relied on to support, for foundation support. It's still important, I think, to understand the spatial distribution of the permafrost in your community and to think about whether there are any risks to buildings even in those areas. So that's a general sensitivity that kind of gives you an idea of whether or not you're at a sort of a high sensitivity area or a low sensitivity area for your community. And what I want to do now is move down at the community scale and think about the community scale when we look at spatial variability, when we look at hazards in the community, how can we integrate that into community planning? And one of the really good guides that has just come out recently is the CSA guide for building in permafrost conditions. It's geared towards new community infrastructure and to help support decision making. It's a really comprehensive document. If you haven't seen it, it has overview chapters on permafrost and explaining permafrost and what's relevant to communities. It goes through climate change projections for the North and permafrost under changing climate conditions. And it goes through all the various forms of foundations and what kinds of foundations work in permafrost. And then at the end, it has a screening tool for new buildings and infrastructure, for siting new buildings and infrastructure. It is available for Northwest Territories communities free of charge from the NWT. So please do contact Sarah Brown if you don't have a copy already. And what I've done is taken their screening tool that was designed for site screening, so for siting a single building, and used it to think about how we might actually think about the whole community and land use planning and suitability. And really there's 3 steps there to do this. And the first one is to assess and map local conditions. So for example, as was done for Paulatuk. And the next is to come up with that hazard map, and then I think the really important step is to then think about the implications for communities. What does this mean? How can we bring this into planning, and how can we use it? So I'm going to walk through these steps with some examples. So in terms of assessing local conditions, and I think it was interesting we said, does your community have hazard maps? And a lot of times people actually don't know, or the data is not readily available yet, and I think that the data is coming quickly now, and Brian's going to share some of the recent initiatives from ENR to get better mapping done. But there are a number of ways that you can start to pull together hazard maps anyway. And one is starting with aerial photos, reading clues in the landscape, and then engaging in detailed mapping. So I'm going to go through those, and I'm also going to share 3 examples from the Northwest Territories. Aerial photos are a good way to start. You can generally see if there are some larger landscape features that show the significance or the presence of permafrost. In this condition, in this example in Paulatuk, the ice wedges indicate actually significant ground ice content around Paulatuk. You can look for clues in the landscape, and that's everything from looking for drunken forests to taking a look as you're driving along the roads at things like these tipped highway markers. So you can see that this one that's tipped here would have used to have been upright, but due to the settlement down here, it's actually starting to tip, and highways has been filling in that road. I think it's also interesting to note the water body right next to it, because the water bodies do absorb tremendous amounts of heat in the summer and can transmit those down into the permafrost and contribute to some permafrost degradation and potentially some of the settlement that's happening here. So that's an example of reading the landscape to look for clues. Detailed mapping has been undertaken, and including going out and actually looking at soils and looking at again the landscape features and clues. This map was done for Sigachik by Ecology North and EBA, and mapped out different soil types and started to make some assessments around which areas were more or less suitable for building on. Academic studies and other studies also provide some information. So there was quite a bit of work done by Joe et al. And also I believe with Ed Hove from EBA, looking at the impacts on buildings of changing permafrost conditions under different climate change scenarios. That was published in 2007 and 2008. They looked at a number of communities, and this is an example from Inuvik. I've adapted this and remapped it using Google Earth. And here what they found was that in general, Inuvik could be divided into two different ground profiles. There's quite a lot of variability in the soils, but they generalized into two soil profiles in Inuvik. And the first soil profile had about 1.5 meters active layer underlain by gravel and till that had quite a bit of ice content. And the second profile had a larger active layer, 2.5 meter active layer, underlain by very ice-rich peat and ice lenses, and then underlain by sand and gravel. And what's interesting, I think, when you look at the modeling that was done, Joe modeled the impacts of changing permafrost conditions on buildings and building foundations, and you can see there's these are the two soil profiles, profile 1 and profile 2, and along the left what they have are these are different climate change scenarios. So these actually have modeled into the future different levels of warming in that community. And when you look at those different levels of warming in the community, and you look at profile 1, you can see that in a couple of those future scenarios, there is not that much impact to the buildings. One of them, there will be more impact to the buildings, right? So this area, depending on the level of warming in the future, is going to have some impacts to buildings. But profile 2, that one that had the active layer underlain by ice-rich peat and ice lenses, all of the buildings, no matter which warming scenario they were looking at, almost all of the buildings, their modeling showed could be impacted by that warming. So you can start to see that there is some difference even across a single community in how the permafrost could respond to climate change and warming. A final example of local mapping, again done by Melanie Irvine, is from Ulukhaktok, where what they noted was that ice wedges and thermokarst, which is a landform formed by permafrost, visible in the west side of the community, and then there is bedrock near the ground surface in other parts of the community, and in those areas, if the piles can be grouted directly to the bedrock, then the risk of those buildings and foundations moving with changes in permafrost is reduced, very, completely reduced, really. So again, looking at where are some of the places where you can get very solid foundations in that community. So once you've done all of that assessment and the mapping and looking at a number of different conditions, and you could layer in a number of maps, as was done in Paulatuk, you could start looking at other hazards as well and layering them in, whether it's wildfire risk or flooding. You then have a hazard map. And so the question then is, what are the next steps? So in terms of using the hazard mapping, there's a number of ways it can be used, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but I did want to run through a couple ways. First is to determine suitable land uses. And you can see a number of examples of this. So one would be in the Sigachik poster and the permafrost mapping, starting to look at what kinds of soils there were and whether those soils are unsuitable. So for example, a silt floodplain would be unsuitable, not good to build on, or whether they need assessment. So in a couple of the other soils, the fluvial terraces with some gravel, for example, or gravel is good to build on. The clay and silt till, again, there's gravel mixed into that, but it's variable, would need assessment at a site scale to understand the implications for building. One of the other ways we can think about using the hazard map is to make a suitability matrix, thinking about what's suitable for development. So in a high hazard area is low suitability for development and may be excluded from development in a community plan and a land use plan. Moderate hazards may be an area that's zoned to be developed with specific conditions, so maybe it does need site-specific assessments to be done. And then low hazard areas would be the most suitable for development. I like to take this one step further, and instead of just thinking about levels of restriction, and actually really start to think about what are suitable land uses for those areas so that they can be put into a land use plan. So high hazard areas, for example, most suitable as open space or environmental reserves. Moderate or medium suitability for development might be most suitable for parks or non-permanent structures like storage sheds, may also be suitable for some development under certain conditions. And then the high suitability for development is great for residential, commercial, town hamlet center, etc. And then from this, you can then turn this into, put this as an input into the land use planning map and land use plan and zoning for communities. An example would be Fort Simpson's land use plan that has the slumping areas along the river now as part of their environmental reserve. You can also use hazard mapping to decide what kind of conditions you need for development. So here's an example from the CSA Technical Guide where you can actually assign risk levels at the site level specifically, and then determine what kind of engineering studies are required for that. So you can see if you've got a risk level A, they're saying that's a high risk level and you need a detailed quantitative study. Whereas if your risk level is D, which is very low, there's no analysis required. So here it's important, I think, to ensure that any community consultants are familiar with the CSA guide, and also very important to ensure that you're thinking about the end of life for buildings and infrastructure when you're assessing what kind of foundations they're going to need. So you want to look at what conditions are going to be in 50 years out or at the end of life, and not just the current conditions that you're under. Another example of setting conditions for development would be to actually set them in zoning and bylaws. So you may want to have a regulation that protects permafrost during construction. It reduces the amount of organic material, for example, that is removed or disturbed during construction. You may require site designs to include a site drainage plan, a snow removal plan, and maintaining the organic layer around the building. So that would be another example of a way that you could set conditions for development. And these conditions, I think, are important, again, because of that buffer layer and how important that buffer layer is. This was a study that was done in Alaska, and over a period of about 25 years, they measured what happened to the active layer and the permafrost after the soil and organic layer had been removed. And you can see that the active layer, the freeze-thaw layer, the seasonal freeze-thaw, deepened and thickened over the period of time that they were measuring this, so that after 26 years it had actually declined down to 22 feet in depth. And this is what communities do have some control over. Communities don't have control over the rate and change of climate right now, but do have some control over the local conditions. And then lastly, you can use hazard mapping to support existing infrastructure and buildings and try to determine what kind of risk and impacts might be happening there. Engineers Canada has had a climate change committee called PIVC, and they have a protocol for assessing existing infrastructure that was used, for example, to assess Highway 3. And that protocol can be used by consultants to look at infrastructure that is potentially most at risk. And then you could use that to prioritize your capital spending and your asset management planning. And last, you can also make sure that you've got site-specific permafrost measures. And again, the Permafrost 101 video goes through a number of those, and the ENR homeowners guide that Brian is going to talk about shows homeowners how they can mitigate some of these challenges with permafrost by ensuring that they keep the snow away from the building, for example, and those kinds of things. So with that, I wanted to just ask if there were any questions or comments on this part, and if you have them, you can type them into T, and T is going to moderate questions, so please do send questions or comments to T, and we'll see.
Do you have an example of the types of buildings that you think are most at risk?
Thanks, T. And I don't think I do right now, but I would say, just off the top of my head thinking about it, if you've got buildings that are on piles that are not grouted into bedrock but are into permafrost, and you're in a cold permafrost state that's shifting to warm quite rapidly, I would say that that's an example of one that's going to be at risk. So I think what we'll do now is turn it over to Brian and let him share some of the ENR initiatives that he's been working on. And I'll just pass my change presenters here, and we'll go to Brian.
Thanks, Ellen. Excellent presentation and sort of segue to the ENR initiatives. So I'm going to talk about the initiatives that the government Northwest Territories is undertaking to provide knowledge to decision makers at all levels, including private industry, to allow climate change adaptation to be considered in operational decisions. I'm briefly going to talk about organizations to facilitate and review some of the action projects in the Northwest Territories. Our significant client territorial adaptation strategy that was agreed to by the premiers of the Yukon and Northwest Territories in Inuvik in April. And our three territories have been to work information on climate change adaptation. Information on this can be found at northernvision.ca. We also collaborate with other provincial and territorial and federal governments in areas such as tools for assessing vulnerability to watersheds, the Canadian Council of Ministers of Environment, and the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers has developed a series of tools through the Climate Change Task Force. Also note that our Department of Transportation has similarly been working with Transport Canada on their expert groups on permafrost to develop the tool. The NWT Association of Communities, the LNFDNA, and NAPEG, which is the Association of Professional Engineers of Geoscientists in the North. New knowledge to support active decision making. The government of the territories has a partnership with Wilfrid Laurier University, and noting that Wilfrid is doing considerable work on permafrost in the Northwest, including near Scott Creek, where over the last 60 years they've determined from a 38% loss in the discontinuous permafrost. We're also working with the University of Alaska, New Changing Cold Regions Network, and the U.S. Landscape Conservation Cooperative. We have lots of federal collaboration. One to really distress is Aboriginal Northwest Canada adaptation, and I'll go into more detail on them with them in a moment. We also work with Natural Resources Canada in the past with collaboratives application platform, which I'll discuss sea level rise, coastal erosion, the Canada Centre for Remote Sensing, and the Canadian Forest Service. The Northern Infrastructure Standards Initiative, which I'll describe more information, Canadian Space Agency, and CANOR. Aboriginal Affairs Northern Development Canada really needs to be commended for their multi-year partnership with the government of the Northwest Territories. They're providing us $2 million to support mainstreaming by our government departments and support pan-territorial adaptation projects such as the permafrost workshop that was Ellen mentioned earlier. Hopefully everyone can hear me now. Adaptation between overall group and then working groups that are sectorally working sectors. And the one that is most significant to one of the ones the most significant Northwest Territories is a Northern Working Group. One project I'll just mention, and we'll be putting this result on our territorial government website, NWTClimateChange.ca, which is at the bottom of the slides, is Natural Resources Canada recently funded a project with McGill and Earth Science International doing inventory of climate risks to the built environment in northern Canada. So this is a really good capture of what's going on across the north in the three territories, as well as northern Quebec and northern Labrador. I also want to mention the Northern Infrastructure Standards Initiative. This is funded by Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada, and working with the Standards Council, they're developing 4 new building codes to facilitate climate change adaptation. One of them is looking at community drainage. As I mentioned earlier, water can really lead to the thawing of permafrost. So they are developing standards for community drainage. 2, looking at devices which help maintain the permafrost under buildings. Looking at risk management of snow loads in northern buildings, and managing the effects of permafrost degradation on existing buildings. Now let's briefly tell you about some of our adaptation projects currently underway in the government of the Northwest Territories. First of all, organizational difference. The change unit of the Environment and Natural Resources Territories and instigate projects for the common good of all departments, while as our frontline departments, such as transportation and public works, mainstream or make adaptation part of their everyday operations. Some of our hazard mapping projects underway include permafrost displacement mapping, and as Ellen was showing you with her introduction to permafrost, with climate change, there's more movement of the active layer, and the active layer is each year done by in Yellowknife by Natural Resources Canada Geologic Survey and Canada Centre for Remote Sensing with assistance from the NWT. And Aboriginal Affairs in Northern Development Canada and the Canadian Space Agency are providing funding for mapping of Inuvik, Norman Wells, Fort Simpson, and Ulukhaktok. And we're eventually hoping, working with the Centre for Geomatics, also hoping to achieve mapping to most NWT communities. So here's an example of cross displacement map. So this is showing you where the top of that satellite, and this map here is for Yellowknife, and you can download a PDF of this at nwtclimatechange.ca, and you can see individual streets and buildings. So blue is where there's no movement, but you also can see where there's upward movement and down. You can see in the Yellowknife part on the left that there's considerable movement, and on the edge of Old Town. So this 1 year's of display data, but there will be additional data for communities. Another hazard mapping concern, one of the issue for us is community wildfire protection plans, and our forest management division of our department, with assistance from the climate change group, has been mapping and this map here is for Delaunay, and we're essentially mapping fuels, and this is useful in areas where it might be possible to lower the risk, potentially could remove fuels. And again, these links to these reports can be found at nwtclimatechange.ca, and they exist for most NWT communities that are located in the boreal forest. Another initiative we're doing for the greater good of all departments is developing climate change scenarios. And
I guess doing just some climate data, but also looking at ecosystem shifts. And this is a project that we worked on with the University of Fairbanks. They did some research using films, which are over the next 80 years, potentially with climate change. And if you look at the brown here on the bottom of the slide, that is an ecosystem that's currently sort of similar to Estevan, Saskatchewan. And you can see that by 2090, it's sort of predicting areas near Hay River will shift from boreal forest to shortgrass prairie. So that's quite a radical change. Again, this is just modeling, but it does indicate significant changes are predicted. Further notes here is that the research showed that the tree line was going to be moving north, the tundra was becoming shrubbier, and one of the other consequences is that the entire landscape of the Northwest Territories was predicted to have 2 to 3 complete ecosystem shifts for all the Northwest Territories. That has implications for our no protected areas. Folks were very interested in this, as it means there will be considerable change coming to our protected areas. We're also generating climate change scenarios for Northwest Territories communities, and these projections will be available this winter, and we'll have a link on our website at nwtclimatechange.ca for all 33 communities. Also want to acknowledge some of the work being done by our infrastructure departments to support climate change adaptation decision making. Our Department of Transportation is on the front line of climate change, and they're incorporating climate change into their day-to-day decision making. They've developed a departmental adaptation plan. As Ellen mentioned, there's this protocol for risk assessment developed by Engineers Canada, and if this has been applied to NWT Highway 3, looking at the risk of climate change degradation to the highway. And the department has done risk assessments for most of the infrastructure, including highways, ferry system, airports, and developing tools for assessing them, such as permafrost, the risk of thawing permafrost to airports. Equally, our Public Works and Government Services Department maintains most of our government buildings in the Northwest Territories, so they're developing many tools as well. Some of them include tools for building foundations in permafrost using thermosiphons. These are coming out of the ground. And thermosiphons help extract heat out of the ground in the winter to help permafrost recharge and rebuild. So it's a kind of technology that works similar to it's sort of a heat exchanger similar to your fridge, and this can be used near a building to maintain permafrost. We also have a new project with funding for Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development, where we're assessing the building vulnerability to thawing permafrost and increasing snow loads. And essentially, many of our buildings were built, our older buildings were built some time ago when climatic conditions were different, and we're finding now with climate change we're getting more wetter snow. So we're developing tools that will assess our building infrastructure to know what risk those buildings are a potential failure in the future, and for prioritizing maintenance and replacement, and similar tools for assessing the risk of thawing permafrost. Just going to briefly mention some of the other projects that are being sort of mainstreamed by G&W departments with our funding for Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada. For those of you that aren't aware, last winter mountain pine beetle survived in the Northwest Territories for the first time. So given this, we're using some funding to complete a mountain pine beetle vulnerability assessment. We're also conducting a municipal hazardous waste risk assessment. So we're inventorying hazardous waste in the Beaufort Delta and looking at climate change risks, including slumping and coastal erosion, to prioritize sites for removal and develop best practices. Looking at terrain mapping and prediction where slumping will occur due to thawing permafrost and risk to cultural sites and infrastructure. The building vulnerability project we mentioned. And a project that I think we're really excited about, our Community Affairs Department is planning to update our territorial emergency plan, but to inform this, we're doing a territorial hazard assessment looking at the risk of climate change, such as potential risks of increases in wildfire and flooding. So best information on climate change can influence emergency planning in the Northwest Territories, and this is directly used by the 8 communities. I guess one of the big issues with climate change adaptation is getting the best information out to decision makers. So this is a whole field of extension. Some of the projects that we're undertaking, as was mentioned by Ellen, is the Permafrost workshop. That's going to be taking place here in November, November 5, 6, and 7 at the Explorer Hotel. For those of you from afar, you can participate by webcasting the entire workshop, so please go to the website there and take a look for more information. I'd like to acknowledge again the funding from Aboriginal Affairs in Northern Development Canada, significant funding that's allowing this workshop to take place, as well as the Canadian Northern Economic Development Agency. Another project that we've started with funding from Aboriginal Affairs, and we're jointly working on with the other territories, is producing plain language information notes. And the idea is that each territory is undertaking climate change adaptation projects that are of interest across the North. So if we can know the best practices from other territories, we don't need necessarily to reinvent the wheel. And this is really consistent with the pan-territorial adaptation strategy. And here is a project, one of our notes describing our building vulnerability project. But altogether, there's approximately 23 notes that have been produced. One of the projects we undertook with our Forest Management Division with Natural Resources Canada funding was trying to reduce the risk for homeowners and communities. And there's a series of leaflets that can be downloaded from our website at nwtclimatechange.ca. And the common sense things on reducing the amount of fuel, so shrubs, leaves around your house, cleaning out your gutters. So it gives common sense guides that you can do to reduce the risk, given that many of our communities are located in the boreal forest, and we're expecting much higher fire frequency with climate change. So these are common sense things that can really reduce the risk and relatively easy to do. So please take a look at this, at these publications. And as alluded to, we're producing the Homeowner's Guide to Permafrost. This is a publication that we undertook with a contractor named Craig Scott, who produced some fabulous material for us, and a similar publication has been produced for Inuvik, for those of you in Inuvik. And this has common sense actions that homeowners can take to reduce damage to their home, how to maintain the permafrost. We're looking at things such as drainage, and when you communities where you have water tanks for your house, making sure that the water tank isn't overfilled, leading to thawing of permafrost. So this is a publication that will be of use to homeowners. For further information, please feel welcome to contact me. My email is there, and I look forward to providing any information I can to those interested in climate change adaptation.
Some of the sources that we use today and that Brian has also shared: the Permafrost 101 video, the CSA Technical Guide, the Homeowner's Guide, and a book on landscape planning and integrating environmental systems into landscape planning and community planning. And there's a number of other great resources out there. Brian showed quite a few of them as well. PIVC protocols, the building practices for northern facilities, that kind of thing. So any questions again on those, or if you want to follow up on those, you can get in touch with myself or with Brian. So again, we wanted to say thanks very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the Permafrost workshop in November in Yellowknife.